Morning, ladies and gentlemen. So it gives me the greatest of pleasure to welcome to the 10th Annual African Economic Forum the inspirational Mr. Arnold Ekpe. Mr. Ekpe is a giant of African banking. He's been associated with EcoBank, the largest bank in Africa, for almost 20 years. He's been in the banking market in Africa for over 30 years, including at Citibank. Mr. Ekpe is retired, almost, kind of. As he says, if you go to rest, you're going to die soon, right? So he's still active and living out in Oxford. Mr. Ekpe, I think his achievements speak for themselves in growing EcoBank from a bank in 8 countries to over 33. His tremendous experience and knowledge and understanding of Africa is incredible. And so without further ado, we can welcome Mr. Arnold Ekpe.
The slide presentation. Yes, okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Arnold Ekpe. In my former life, I used to be the chief executive of the EcoBank Group, but I find it rather embarrassing to introduce myself as chief executive as a former chief executive. I think life moves on. But I think what's interesting is that many of you have managed to be here at this time on a Saturday morning. I really do appreciate it, because Saturdays is usually time for you have other things to do. It's also very interesting that the keynote speaker this afternoon, Mr. Alexoti, used to work with me when he started his banking career, and also Mrs. Alakija, who's left banking to become a very successful entrepreneur. So Africa is very big, but Africa is also very small. But this morning, what I'd like to talk about is in the context of the so-called African Renaissance shaping outcomes, and particularly because my experience has been largely in the private sector, I'd like to talk about building African champions. And I hope you'll excuse me if I use EcoBank as an example, not because we've achieved very much, but because we've tried to do something in a market and at a time when most people felt that Africa was hostage to foreign investment and hostage to foreign influences. Now, if you look at what's been going on in Africa for the last decade, there is a view now, and I think it's a view that I'm beginning to share, that the development and the changes in Africa are sustainable. I have been involved in the African banking industry for over 33 years, and during that period of time, we've seen significant changes. Some of those changes have been good, and some of those changes have not been very good. But the context in which this has happened, I think, is very important. African economies, over the last 50 years, regressed significantly, and then started moving forward over the last decade. Some of it due to specific action by African governments, some of the Arab Spring reforms that are taking place in North Africa happened in the rest of Africa 2 decades ago. Dictatorships are no longer fashionable, so democracy is taking root. The impact of technology, modern technology, especially the mobile phone technology and international media, has meant that Africa is far more exposed to the rest of the world than it has ever been. And very few African leaders can today say to themselves that we can close off our countries or our economies from the rest of the world. So the world over the last decade has been very good to Africa, and Africa has taken advantage of that. But we're now moving to a stage where I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the future for Africa? And I'll tell you, I've attended a lot of these conferences over the last 25 years, and every one of them, I'm sure I'm not working this right. Can you? Every one of them, okay, talks about the African hope. It's just round the corner. Just round the corner. And if you banked your career in Africa, I think you've had a pretty raw deal. But now I think there's time for change. And I think Africa and Africans have to play an important role in shaping those outcomes. That's what I want to talk to you about today. And I think we have to look at Africa in a very objective and pragmatic way. There's a tendency, I think, in Africa to say, as most business school guys say, hope is not a strategy. You've got to take that hope and turn it into reality. Every African country and most African businessmen will tell you, we want to build a new Africa. They will talk the talk. But when you want to move from talk to action, then I think you start running into a lot of problems. In 1996, I was 42, I think maybe 40, going on 43. It's not a very good age for a man. I think that's when middle age sets in. Some men get a second wife, a new model. Some get a Ferrari and start to wear leather jackets, and some do both. But I said I'd go and work for EcoBank. EcoBank was based in Lomé in Togo. How many people here have been to Togo? I'm actually really impressed, you know. The last time I did this, only one hand went up. But Togo is it's a very small country in the middle of Africa, West Africa, and used to be one of 4 German colonies in Africa. It's got a population of 5 million people. It's got a GDP of 6 billion as we speak. The question is, how can you build a Pan-African bank out of one of the smallest countries in the continent, where the language spoken is not English, which is the international business language, but French? Shaping outcomes. Nationals build nations and not foreigners. This is not always understood because a lot of talk goes about foreign investment and foreign aid. But it's not always understood that foreign investment, foreign aid can only supplement the effort by the nationals, unless Africans themselves start to build Africa. It's highly unlikely that foreigners would be encouraged to build Africa. If you look at the United States, the biggest companies in the United States are American companies. The biggest companies in Britain, I hate to admit it, but I also live in Oxford. I like the British. Same thing in China, Italy, you go. What that tells you is that the nationals have as much stake in good governance and in economic development. And that forms the spur and the catalyst for developing the country. The lesson that Africa is beginning to learn, and we're now beginning to see that because you have groups such as Dangote that have come from nowhere to create, I think, the 6th or 7th largest cement group in the world. You have MTN out of South Africa that's created, I think, the 9th largest mobile telecoms group in the world. Is that Africans, when they believe in Africa, and when they make the investment, and when they move from hope to execution, can form the spur for the transformation of the continent. We had the same belief in EcoBank. When I joined EcoBank, we were in, 5 countries. The group was likely bankrupt. But we felt that as nationals, we had the ability, we had the belief, and we had the commitment to transform. So what did we do? We moved from talk, let's talk, to action. And over a period of actually 12 years, we moved EcoBank into 33 African countries. Class, how many of you have been to 10 African countries? It's not bad. 20? Numbers drop significantly. 30? 40? 50? I put up my hand. Okay. But we moved into 33 African countries, and the logic was very simple. We saw Africa as a territory that we understood was home market for us. And so when people talk about Central African Republic, you can see the absolute look of fear on their faces. Okay? But we run the biggest bank in that country. It's very profitable. Makes us fantastic return on equity. Because you go beyond the perception to the reality. The reality of it is that Central African Republic belongs to what they call the Francophone zone. The Francophone zone has managed a single currency, or started doing that 50 years before the euro. And they've done it successfully. They've had one central bank. They haven't had big quarrels about central banks. They've had one central bank for the last 70 years or so. They have shown the positive impact of nationals working together to shape outcomes. So in spite of the rebel activities, in spite of the uncertainty and the political instability, the currency remains the same, remains stable. And you can run a bank if the currency is stable. We also happen to run the biggest bank in Chad. We run the biggest bank in Liberia. Do you see a trend there? We like difficult countries. Because the others are scared. You know, they don't want to come. You know. I remember talking to Mr. Dangote a long time ago. I used to run a bank called UBA. UBA needed some fixing, so I agreed to do that. And he was setting up a cement plant, and he was going to make an investment of $700 million or thereabouts. And I asked him, I said, look, aren't you afraid that Cemex or Holcim or Heidelberg or one of these huge companies will come in and they will take you over, they will take over the market? And I remember what he said to me. He said, Arnold, they won't. And I said, why? He said, you tell me which board of directors anywhere in the world will vote $700 million for an investment in the center of Nigeria. And the answer is none. When MTN acquired a license in Nigeria, which is now by far their largest investment, and which has essentially bankrolled their expansion, the share price dropped 10% on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Perception, reality. The reality is that that turned out to be the best investment they ever made, and moved MTN from being an also-ran next to Vodacom to being the largest mobile telephone company in Africa. The reality is that that decision by Mr. Dangote moved him from just a cement producer in Africa to the 6th or 7th largest cement producer in the world. Achievement. Again, talking and taking action. It's a state of mind. A lot of people talk about economic development, and they talk about money, about transformation, but in every single country that we've looked at, beyond the statistics, the fundamental change that resulted in economic development and market transformation is in the mind. When you believe in Africa, when you believe in what you can do, you take a long-term view. Nestle has been in Africa for 70 years. They have never left. In spite of all the problems, I think they know something. Unilever never left. On the contrary, they're investing more. Heineken. Perception and the reality are two different things. Africans and African nations can achieve a lot if they can change their mindset. And the mindset change, ladies and gentlemen, is the most difficult challenge we face today. It's a battle that we face today. It's a battle that I faced when I was running EcoBank. How can you come from Togo and say you want to build a Pan-African bank? Are you nuts? And I said, what's wrong with Togo? Because the perception is that if you want to build a Pan-African bank, it's going to come out of Johannesburg or London or New York, but not out of Africa. The biggest challenge we face today in the transformation of Africa, beyond the fact that Africa is fashionable and all that, is changing minds. And I want to talk about money, not because bankers are not the most popular professionals these days, but they're also human beings, in fact. People tend to forget that. We're not all sort of like horrible people. We have families, we have kids, and stuff like that. We're good husbands and brothers and uncles. We don't just go around ripping off the country. The biggest banks in the USA are American banks. The biggest banks in the UK where I live are British banks. The biggest banks in Germany are German banks. The biggest banks in China are Chinese banks. The biggest banks in France are French banks. And the biggest banks in South Africa are South African banks. The biggest bank in Nigeria now are Nigerian banks. I'm not saying this because I'm a banker. I'm saying this because if you don't have the finance, you cannot develop. You can have the nice mental state, you can want to act, but you've got to have the money. The Nigerian economy transformed partly because of fundamental economic changes. But if you look at the major transformation of that economy, it happened because the banks were consolidated into big banks that could finance development. Small banks do not finance development. So if you look at where the big companies come from, they come from countries where the big banks are located. And that's not always understood. In shaping outcomes, African governments and African authorities have to look to creating the right financial platform for that to happen. Tanzania has 43 banks. I think that's 38 too many. That's my view. Kenya has 45. So the importance of financial transformation is not always understood. But it's very, very important in shaping outcomes. I want to talk about EcoBank because EcoBank, whilst it's still work in progress, represents an example of trying to do something in the market in spite of the negative perceptions. The EcoBank Group was started by a bunch of West African businessmen who, when they started, there were really two types of banks in Africa, not just in West Africa, but across Africa. There were either foreign banks or state-owned banks. If you're not close to the politicians, or you do not speak the right business language, doesn't matter how good a businessman is, you really weren't going to go very far. So they created this group called EcoBank and started off in West Africa. And that group was started at the height of the third world debt crisis. Some of you would remember in the late 80s, running into the early 90s. And the group almost went bankrupt, but recovered from that. Today, the group has grown to, I think the figure for 2012, in terms of assets, probably about 20 billion, which makes it larger than any other bank in sub-Saharan Africa except the South African banks. It has about 1,200 branches. It employs about 20,000 Africans. It's in 34 African countries, but it's also in Dubai, China, Paris, and London. But what is interesting about EcoBank is that it's stateless. It's not a Nigerian bank. It's actually not a Togolese bank. It's just a bank has got to have infrastructure somewhere, so it's based in Togo. The board of directors comes from, I think, 9 or 10 different nationalities. Management, 14 nationalities. It is an example of trying to achieve something by harnessing the collective talent and input of Africans and African nations. It's not always been a very easy task. Sometimes when you go, you say, where are you from? They said, Lome, Togo, where? And you have the central bank that say, you want to come and buy a bank in Kenya, and where are you from? And we said, well, you know, Lome is somewhere in West Africa. But we don't have to say that anymore because the group is very well known. But the most important thing and the most fascinating thing and exciting thing about it is that the fact that the group went beyond the perception and said, let's build something Pan-African, has meant that the concept of a Pan-African strategy today is not strange. Most groups now say we want to be Pan-African or we're Pan-African. I think that sent a very powerful message for the simple reason that Africa is made up of too many countries. There are 55 countries in Africa. Half of the landlocked countries in the world are based in Africa. You've got to ask yourself whether they're fundamentally, some of them, economically viable. So the future for that continent has to be in creating larger markets. The future for that continent has to be in having the nationals themselves understand that they are the ones who have the primary responsibility for developing Africa. There's a recent article in The Economist on Africa which is very positive, and it's a very good thing, and very pragmatic. But one of the things that's not always understood is that the message about Africa is not always a clear message. Which country or which nation has the largest number of poor people in the world? It's not Africa. Look at the statistics. There are far more poor people in China than there are in Africa as a whole. There are far more poor people in India than there are in Africa as a whole. What do they talk about China? Growth, industrialization. India, one of the big countries. Africa, poverty. But those of you who've been to a place like Lagos or Nairobi or Johannesburg or Abidjan or Dakar know that there is a different, a very exciting and positive story about Africa that is yet to be told. And that's been, I think the beginnings are there. And we're seeing a lot of exciting young Africans, a lot of exciting African governments as well, who are moving from talk to action. So I'd like to conclude, so that maybe if you have any questions or you don't agree with me, by quoting what Nelson Mandela said after it was released. It always seems impossible until it is done. ShopRite is now in so many countries. MTN, EcoBank, Dangote, and there's a whole slew of them. Various stages of growth and development. So as Africa becomes fashionable, as Africa begins to attract the right sort of commentary and news, let's not forget that ultimately Africa will shape the outcome of the continent. That, I hope, is the message I want to leave with you today. The future is Africa, but Africa is also its future. Thank you very much.
So we've got two microphones in the back of the room. If there's any questions, you can just raise your hand, please. Any questions?
Thank you for coming, sir. So, a couple, should I introduce myself? I'm Dabo Borsfall. I work for Morgan Stanley Infrastructure Partners. My question for you is, maybe 10, 15 years ago, everyone would argue that the key gating item to development of the continent was political and economic reform. I think we've moved past that. It's still an issue, but we moved past that. But today, most people would say infrastructure is a key impediment to development, especially given, say, the pace of population growth in a country like Nigeria. I'm happy to know that visionaries like you have, they're not fully retired. I see that you are also on the board of the newly established Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which has.
I'm not sure that's a good or bad thing, but yes,
okay,
yes, I am. Yes.
So please talk about that.
Yeah.
If that's the case. And one of the core missions of that fund is infrastructure development. So please, can you speak about how you intend to improve infrastructure in Nigeria through that deal?
Okay, I can take them one at a time. I think you've touched on something that also speaks to the point I was trying to make about moving from talk to action. Infrastructure has been a problem in Africa for decades. It's not a new problem. The biggest power plant in the world doesn't take more than 3 years to build. I used to be an engineer. So why have we spent 50 years not doing anything? And that is the challenge. So my problem is not infrastructure. My problem is people understanding that that problem needs to be fixed. And I think there are two tracks we have to look at there. And then I'll come to the infrastructure fund. Across Africa, we face a major infrastructural challenge. If that is fixed, the World Bank says very clearly Africa moves into double-digit growth. So why isn't it being fixed? That is the question. It's not being fixed because the government and the decision makers need to move from talk to action. Build the power plant. It doesn't have to be the cheapest. Sometimes we talk about corruption, but if it's built, it will at least contribute to the economy. But if you talk and talk and talk and visit power plants globally every year for 10 years, and you don't do anything in your country, you don't have a power plant. You don't have the power. And that's what's going on. Now, the reason why I agreed to join the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund was twofold. One was Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the Minister for Finance, and she's an incredible lady. I mean, this woman she's a man. I think that's the biggest compliment. That's the biggest compliment I can give. And please don't think I'm being sexist, but if we had men like her, we wouldn't have too many problems in Africa. But she's, sorry? Better than a man. Okay. I agree. So she's an incredible, and really, for me, this is a vote of confidence. I really want to see how I can help her do what she's trying to do. But the fund has been structured in a very interesting way. It consists of 3 sub-funds. It consists of a New Generations Fund, which is the one that really is for the future, and then that's the Infrastructure Fund, which is supposed to be invested in infrastructure. And then there's a Stability Fund, which is the one the government can dip into from time to time if it needs to fix any budget deficit. Okay. Now, as you know, I'm not really keen on the Stability Fund because they should manage their affairs properly. The Infrastructure and the New Generations Fund make a lot of sense. Okay. And that's what we're investing a lot of time and effort in. And what we want to position the Sovereign Wealth Fund is as a preferred partner to major infrastructure parties such as yourselves or whoever wants to come into the country. We're willing to partner with them. In that case, they have the political insurance, okay, and they have access to risk sharing on the financial side as well. And we can open doors for them in terms of getting approvals and all that. So that's really what the fund is trying to do. It's not started yet, but it might interest you to know that there's a case in court saying that the fund is illegal. So you have to understand that we're not quite sure where it's going to end up.
Next question from the lady there, please.
You said there are too many countries in Africa and the businesses are looking to pan Africa. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what is the political structure going to look like in Africa? Are there going to be fewer countries? Is it going to be more cooperation?
My sense is that firstly, the African countries are coming to understand that if they don't cooperate and create bigger markets, that Asia is going to eat their lunch. It's as simple as that. I lived in Togo off and on for 12 and a half years. I mean, Togo is 5 million people. It has no chance in hell of going anywhere. But next to Togo is Nigeria. Next to Togo is Ghana. Next to Togo is Cote d'Ivoire. Those markets collectively add up to, what, 180 million people? If you open up the boundaries, if you break down the barriers, suddenly it's no longer a country of 5 million people. It's a market of 200 million people. So if you do that, I, as an investor, I don't have a problem locating my factory in Togo. It's actually a very nice place. It's got the best natural beach in the world, okay, and some very good seafood. And Lagos is, 20 minutes by air, 2 hours, 3 hours by road. A lot of African countries are coming to that realization. Some of you may have heard about the East African Community, and that was a very good example. Prior to independence, there was an East African Community. When independence set in, every single African country wanted to have its own airline, its own central bank, its own currency, football team, you name it. It doesn't make sense. And we told them so. Fast forward 50 years later, the East African Community, Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and what's the fifth one now?
Rwanda.
And Rwanda have come together. And they are trying to create what the Francophone countries have created successfully. One currency, no tariffs, one central bank, and all that. And if they do that, suddenly, that market is almost as big as Nigeria. It's 120 million people. It becomes far more attractive than Burundi on its own, or Rwanda its own, or Uganda on its own. And they've decided to fast track it, and we wish them luck. I hope they get it done, because that would change that market completely. Africa and Africans need to create bigger markets. Bigger markets is the key to success. The small countries would only survive if they're part of a bigger economic bloc.
Gentlemen, can you introduce yourself and your name for this? Microphone, please.
Thank you very much, Arnold, for the talk for East African community. I'm on the advisory board of the ADB, and I'm delighted to be here and ask you a question. Mali has been in the news a lot, and of course Nigeria has the north. I wonder if you could address the issue of this kind of disturbances and maybe spreading from the north. What can Africa do to prevent or to kind of mitigate this kind of potential shadow over what I think really is a very bright future as we have painted it?
I think you raised a very, very important question, and that's something that I think has been a major concern of policymakers when I'm talking to them recently. I think part of the problem was that it took everyone by surprise. I know Mali reasonably well. EcoBank has 42 branches there, and we're the second largest bank. And if you want to be honest, very few people saw it coming. I think that's the first thing. But we've gone beyond that now, and I think Mali will be fixed, because fundamentally, if you go into Mali, the extremists do not have much support. It's an imposed situation. That doesn't mean that that situation cannot continue for a while. But the ECOWAS and various parties are coming together because they see that if it's not fixed there, the whole region is potentially at risk. Okay. The thing about West Africa is that it's actually half Muslim. The Sahelian countries, northern Nigeria, and all that are all Muslim-speaking countries. It's only the coastal areas that are Christian-speaking. And these countries and these religions have lived together for a long time, amicably, you know, intermarry. I have lots of friends who are Christians who are married to Muslims, Muslims who are married to Christians. I'm actually the godfather of one of those kids. And so it's come at a bit of a cultural shock of what's going on. The case of Nigeria is a little bit more complicated. I think the Nigerian situation cannot be taken from the political context. The Boko Haram movement is as much a religious as a political group. And I think if the politics is fixed, Boko Haram will be fixed. But the point you raise, which is very important, is that it is beginning to affect investments. It is beginning to affect negatively the perception of Africa. And that can be good at this point in time.
The lady in the back, can you say your name first, please?
You know, when you look at Africa, the culture and the demographics of Africa has been North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa has been more culturally, and in terms of religion, more allied to the Middle East and to the Mediterranean. And there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's this huge desert in between, which makes it extremely difficult to relate. Morocco's done a pretty good job of trying to be more African than Maghreb. But I think in the long run, there's going to be greater integration between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. We're beginning to see that the Moroccan banks, for example, BMC, Attijari Wafa Bank, they've moved very aggressively into Francophone Africa. There's increasing trade between West Africa and Morocco. Morocco sees Africa as an export market. I think Egypt is beginning to do the same through the COMESA, coming down through Sudan, East Africa, and all that. And I think that this is part of the South-South trade, where the South is saying that some of its more attractive export markets, because it's got to be driven more by markets than by politics, would be the rest of Africa. And I think as that happens, the politics will come on the back of it. I have very mixed views about the African Union. Okay, I think that they focus on the wrong things. I think that they should be focusing on the economic integration of Africa. That's very, very important, because that drives the politics. People who trade together, work together, tend not to fight each other that much. And I think the biggest development we've seen in the West is the nature and the extent of economic and market integration that's made it almost impossible for you to really attack your enemy without attacking yourself. I think the more of that we see in Africa, the more. But culturally, North Africans and the rest of Africa have been actually very, very closely allied. People forget, for example, the chief advisor to Gaddafi is not a good example. But was a Nigerian, was of Nigerian origin. And a lot of the people were from Niger and Chad. And if you go to a lot of these African countries, most of them have mixed origins. You trace back 2 or 3 generations and they come from all parts of Africa. And I think that's where Africa is going to go at the end.
Gentleman in the back, please.
Chris Cudley, Made in Africa. Just a quick question. You've been speaking about regional champions and how we build those regional champions. But how do we build them when foreign companies can borrow money at, say, 2%, 1%, and we have issues in Africa as local businesses where we sometimes have to borrow at 25%? Can you just briefly explain our routes out of that problem?
I think that's one of the challenges, but you don't build a regional champion based on just the cost of money. The biggest impediment to investing in Africa is not money. It's not. Never been. It's courage. The willingness to go in there. You know, when I used to run Ekpe Bank, I used to meet a lot of my South African colleagues, and I said, I'm not afraid of you guys. And they said, why? I said, because you don't have the, I don't want to use the word, but it starts with B, to get into those markets. I said, talk to your board. They don't approve for you to go into Chad. My board would. Liberia, we with 45% of the banking industry there. My board would approve it. Your board would not approve it. So the biggest impediment is actually not money. It's the courage to go into that market. Having said that, I talked about finance being key. And the reason for that is very simple. We did an analysis when I was running Ekpe Bank, and we realized that unless African countries created large banks, they were going to find it very difficult to implement their development agenda. Let me give you an example. Prior to 2007, in Nigeria, you couldn't raise $100 million for a project. Today, in a morning, you can raise $3 billion. It changed the dynamic of growth in Nigeria completely. In Ghana, up until about 4 years ago, you couldn't raise $100 million. They were going around the world, you know, asking for 20, 30, 40. And I called the minister. I said, sir, you're making a mistake. Create 3 or 4 big banks. And it changes the dynamic of the country. That to me is far more important than the interest rate. When you do that and the country can significantly finance its own development, then you start seeing champions emerging. That's why South Africa has major champions. Standard Bank is a $200 billion bank. They can do $100 billion projects. And the South African companies depend on the South African banks. The Nigerian companies are depending on the Nigerian banks, which is why some of the Nigerian banks expanded into the rest of Africa. So I guess my view is finance, in terms of interest rates, is not the key. It's access to finance. With a banker that understands your market. You know, if you go to, you talk to some of those guys, they come to New York or London and say, look, we want to put a project and it includes Tanzania and Namibia. And the risk guy says, but there's a problem in Mali. Okay? No, it's a continent, you know. But that's the problem. Now, if you talk to a risk guy in South Africa, he can tell the difference. And so can the guy in Nigeria, wherever. And I think that also, that perception issue also affects access to finance.
Gentleman in the back there, please.
Hi, thanks for coming. Gil Manu, African Sunrise. My question is, we've talked a lot about integration and creating bigger markets. What sort of specific mechanisms would you recommend for getting, for example, EAC, SADC, ECOWAS, basically working more closely together to create these bigger environments so that we can leverage that size to create more opportunities for growth?
The interesting thing about your question is that most of these things don't require any legislative changes. You don't need to go to parliament for anything. If the governments decide today that they're going to take off exchange control, they don't need to go to parliament. They can do it today. And funny enough, that's what the governor in Zambia did 20 years ago. Got up and said no more exchange controls. So that's one major issue, because what that does for you is that it's sometimes easier to export from the US or the UK into Africa than it is from next door. The second thing that I believe they really need to do is to address the issue of free movement of people and goods. Moving things across Africa is incredibly difficult and expensive. It's cheaper to ship from China to Dar es Salaam than it is from Dar es Salaam to Rwanda. That's a fact. It's cheaper to ship from the US to Nigeria than from Dakar to Lagos. Why? Shouldn't be. So the issue of free movement of goods and the enabling environment for that, it's also very important. The other thing that Africans do a lot, which I'm one anyway, is the whole visa fiasco. I hold two passports. I hold a British passport and a Nigerian passport. I go into South Africa, I just show my British passport. I don't need a visa. If I take the Nigerian passport, I have to go to the embassy, to do this and that. Now, how are you going to encourage integration if people can't even move around? And you're not going to have a whole bunch of Nigerians moving to South Africa. The ones that wanted to move have moved already in spite of the immigration rules. Because they know their way around. You know, and ECOWAS, for example, has had immigration, free movement of people for the last, I think, since 1975. It's not changed the demographics much. You haven't seen suddenly the Nigerians colonizing the Burkina Faso or the Ghanaians taking over Cote d'Ivoire. But it has improved trade in that region. It's got one of the highest levels of interregional trade.
The lady in the back there, and then the lady in the front.
Thank you. Rosamund McCrymon from the Network Journal and AfricaStrictlyBusiness.com. You said just in answering the previous question that access to finance is key. And here you're hearing that small, medium-sized businesses are the engine of growth, economic growth. Small businesses and access to finance, that has always been a huge problem. Looking back on Mr. Henry's comment, the interest rates are prohibitive, et cetera, et cetera. So, how do we resolve the two? Small, engine of growth, access to finance, not there.
I want to talk, I'm not sure whether to speak as a former banker or as an entrepreneur now. Because see, I'm on your side to some extent. I like cheap money now that I'm not a banker. But look, the fact of the matter is that SMEs are the lousiest risk you have in banking. They don't pay. The risk is high. Okay, the default rate is very high. So the engine, but also the source of very bad loans. The answer lies somewhere in the middle. You need to do the big banks and the big companies. Because SMEs don't develop a country. Please don't kid yourself about that. You need large companies to create the chain. Example, South Africa. South Africa has one of the best developed agro-industries in Africa. In fact, it has the best. You move out of South Africa, agriculture is struggling to survive. Why? Because the chain isn't there. If you're a major farmer of staple products, who do you sell to? You need to sell to like a convenience chain. They don't exist. So the South African chains are creating those in the rest of Africa. The SMEs when they have a good proposition, have access to funds. You see, the issue about cost of financing doesn't end with the company. You know who pays for it ultimately? The consumer. So you can price it into it. It doesn't sort of like you take the risk and the consumer doesn't take it. MTN borrows from Nigeria in local currency at a very high rate of interest, much higher than they borrow in South Africa. But they can still do it profitably because they pass the cost on to the consumer. All businesses pass their cost on to the consumer, right? That's what businesses are in the business. You know, somewhere or the other you've got to do it. So yes, the issue of lowering cost of money is very important, but it's not an isolated issue. If you don't have good infrastructure, that cost comes into your cost of money. It will affect your cost. If you don't have good infrastructure, you have to pay people more to attract the good people. That gets into your cost. We found out it was cheaper to employ bankers in London than in Lagos. It was about a third cheaper. All of that does affect your cost of money. So the cost of money is not a banking issue, it's an institutional issue. It's about governments not borrowing at very high rates of interest, because if the government is borrowing at 15%, as you know some of the governments are borrowing at, then why would I lend to an SME at 10% when I can get a risk-free exposure at 15%? If my operating costs are very high, I've got to transfer that onto the pricing. If my people costs are high. So it's really a combination of all of that. And the challenge for all of us is if we can work through and have the governments manage better, reduce their cost of borrowing, put in the infrastructure, reduce operating costs. Every single one of our 1,200 branches in Africa has a generating set, has its own power. That cost is paid for by the consumer. We have to pass it on. So the question you're asking is actually a bigger question. It's a question of moving from talk to action, fixing the infrastructure, fixing the government borrowings, fixing the people cost, fixing the operating cost. And if all of that is done right, then the cost will come down. And we've done the analysis to show that. They have the answers. They just haven't done anything about it. It's easier to blame the bankers. It's not our fault. The bank should charge.
Thank you again for being here. You said earlier that Africa to move forward needs a big financial institution. I would say the example of Senegal. Growing up, we had one or two banks, and one day the banks closed, the money's gone. People were wondering, next time I'll think about it twice before putting my money in there. So what do you have to say about that?
Those were small banks. I know because I just came from Dakar. Okay. And let me put the context to you, then you will understand what I mean. EcoBank is a $20 billion bank. The World Bank Credit Union is bigger than EcoBank. In the UMO, Union Monetary, West Africa, EcoBank is the largest banking group. How big are we? $3 billion. In Ghana, we're the biggest bank. How big are we? $2 billion. African banks are small. When banks are small, not only can they not finance development, they're prone to shock. If anything happens, they're done, which is why it's happening in your country. And typically, the governments themselves can't support them. The EcoBank Group is based in Togo, in Lomé, Togo. We get lousy ratings from Fitch and from S&P. It's improved. You know why? Togo's GDP is 6 billion. EcoBank's balance sheet is 20 billion. Who's going to save who? So if you tell us, you're on your own, guys, when anything happens to you, you're dead. So we have to go look for good shareholders, strong shareholders, so they can. But that's the challenge. And even if you want to finance SMEs, the ability to take the shock of those losses, because SMEs are fundamentally profitable in the long run. It's just that in the short run, you could be dead. You need a big balance sheet. So we've told the government that they now understand that what they're trying to do is move from talk to action. And that's what we're hoping wouldn't take too long.
Lady in the back there.
Hi, I'm Seema Agarwal. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm a business student here and also run a company in Kenya. So Kenya I would use as an example. So we have elections coming up on Monday. 5 years ago it was pretty violent, and people don't really know where things are going to be on Monday. So when a country like Kenya, which is very industrialized, has a really good economy, still has political instability, kind of don't really know what's going to happen. How do you think about the growth in Africa or that region? How do you, as a business owner, plan for that and really, shape out something like that?
I'll tell you a story. The last election, the day of the riot in Kenya, I flew into Kenya to buy a bank. And I went to see the governor, Professor Njungu, who's the governor of the central bank. And he says to me, he said, Arnold, you're going to pay the money? I said, Governor, check, the money's in. Came in today. And he said, wow, you're not afraid? I know Kenya, you know Kenya. If people will kill themselves from time to time, that's okay. That's part. Okay, it's not okay, but it's part of the development process. Okay? Look at the history of the world. Go to various countries. The US, you had a civil war here. You killed each other. Before that, you had a war of independence. You have a great nation now. Every country goes through that. That is part of the background of developing countries. The most important thing for us are the fundamentals there. And the fundamentals are there. Kenya has highly qualified professionals. It has the largest tech capability in Africa, because we see all the countries. It is going to overcome these short-term problems. I'm not afraid of that. They're necessary. They upset the risk managers and the private equity firms, but that's okay, because then we can go in and invest and they can come in later and buy us out. Okay? But on that doesn't bother me. You see, what really worries is when the fundamental fabric of government is at risk, when you have the elements of a failed state. But in terms of violence from time to time, you see it all the time. It's in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali. I can give you every single country, Central African Republic, Chad. When I was running EcoBank, they called me and I said, well, is the president safe? Yes. Is the government safe? Yes. Okay, now let's figure out how we save EcoBank's assets and people. Because it will happen. You've got to have I wouldn't mention the word, to be in the emerging markets. But at the same time, folks, emerging markets are very forgiving. You can get away with a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to get in efficient markets.
So we're going to take the last 2 or 3 questions, and then we're going to. So the gentleman right in the back, and maybe the lady here up front, and the gentleman there. The last 3 questions.
I had a pretty, I guess what would probably be a simple question, but I'd like to hear your. Can you hear me? I'd like to hear your opinions either way. How do conferences like this actually, you being, having managed a large African company, how do conferences like this actually contribute directly to Africa? I've been to enough of them. I've met a lot of people who regularly attend these conferences, but I am not on the other end. How do these conferences actually directly contribute to increasing the GDP of African countries?
Contribute to what?
How do these conferences actually help African countries directly? Is it all nice for people to gather here? Is there a direct correlation to people coming to good business schools and going out? How do they directly actually impact Africa?
I was going to be politically correct in answering your question, but I'm not going to be anyway because I'm retired, so I don't have to. There are no consequences on EcoBank even if I answer this. They can disown whatever I say. These conferences, and I've attended things like this over the last 30 years. The theme is pretty much the same. It's hope. The year of transformation. And I attend for two reasons, because I don't really know when that big change is going to start happening, and I don't want to miss it. Okay? Second reason I attend is because I have a lot of respect, and I'm not flattering you guys, for all of you here, because you're the future of Africa. I'm going to be 60 my next birthday. We want to leave a message with you that allows you to begin to think differently. That whilst Africa has problems, those problems can be fixed. That Dangote can build a group, that MTN can build a group, EcoBank can build a group. It can be done. If that message resonates, then I think we'll be making some progress. It may not happen now, it may not happen in a year's time, but if only 2 or 3 people get that message here and 2 or 3 in the others, then that's right. But let me talk to you as business school students or whatever department you come from. Every time I have this speech, they say, we want to go back to change Africa. No, we don't want you back in Africa. Your liabilities. Okay? Let me tell you why. You want a job, so you add to the pool. You want to be some pokey little entrepreneur who's going to start with 1 million or $500,000 and start thinking he's going to build a $20 billion. The one thing that many of you don't do, which I urge you to do, think of joining a major company and working your way up the system and being the African expert. Because if you work for a major company, they can deploy 1-2 billion into Africa easily, because they know they have you there and they know your career is at stake, because you're not going to give them bad advice. And they know that if there's a problem, they have somebody who can actually help them with that problem, who knows both worlds, the standards of the first world and the opportunities in the third world. So one of the messages I always leave behind is, by all means you want to be an entrepreneur, be an entrepreneur. By all means you want to go into Africa and be part of the job statistics, it's okay. But the opportunity, the willingness to join a major company, to be part of your professional development, it's an opportunity that I should not overlook. And it doesn't matter. You're no more African working for GE than working for somebody and sons in Lagos or in Kenya. You're still African wherever you are. But you can be so much more useful if you rise to be the president or the CEO and you say, look, I'm going to take a bet on Africa. I'm going to take $1 or $2 billion. They don't fire you for $1 or $2 billion. Normally, usually when you lose 30% of the share price, that things get very serious. But every now and then, you can get away with 1 or 2%, and you can put the money in Africa, and you'll make far more of a difference than some of the other opportunities. So I hope this is a frank enough answer.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Malika Rafah. I'm a second-year conflict management and international economics student at Johns Hopkins Science. I wanted to ask about something that I've read recently about South Africa. I believe I have now a 30% stake in EcoBank. Yeah. I wanted to inquire, what do you think about the future for EcoBank as well as for African integration?
Good question. I spent the last 4 years in EcoBank building relationship with South Africa. Now, I think it speaks to us shaping our outcomes. Many of you may not have heard of a company called PIC. PIC is the Public Investment Corporation in South Africa. It's a $150 billion fund manager for the South African pension fund. PIC has put aside 5% of that amount, which is $7 billion for investment in Africa. How many of you have heard of that? But how many of you have heard that China, a few years ago, put $5 billion, and all the African heads of states and all the major company executives, including myself, went there to thank them very much for that? The point I'm trying to make is that if we want to shape outcomes, there is significant capital in Africa that's untapped. Nigeria has capital. South Africa has, Morocco has, Egypt has. So I took the decision, and when you're CEO, you have flexibility. The board didn't quite know that's what I was doing. That rather than focus on going to talk to sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East or in China, we would invest in working with African capital. PIC, Nedbank, Old Mutual. So we've built very strong relationships because we feel that that is part of our Pan-Africanness. And the largest investor in Africa, outside of the oil sector, is South African corporate. So the challenge for us is to try and shape our outcomes and look for where the money is at home and then supplement it with money from outside Africa. Nationals develop countries, foreigners help. Yeah.
My name is McAfee. I used to work for Madame Cissé, who was a group head of operation. Good seeing you again. When I see the African continent, I think commodities. Given the lesson learned from Nigeria's oil management, what do you think the strategy of the other countries should be around our commodities, for example, Ghana coming up with oil and the other countries coming up with commodities?
Well, Africa is changing radically. And two things are happening. The importance of oil in changing a lot of countries is taking place. I mean, there's Ghana, I think Togo, they're doing some prospecting there. Basically, if you look at Africa from Angola right through to Senegal, it's the other side that fits into Brazil. So that's the same oil belt. And there's going to be oil there somewhere. There might be gaps in between, but there is oil all over that place. And you end up with the resource curse, i.e., how will that be used effectively? So sometimes you ask yourself, should these countries actually get the oil? Will that unbalance their economies? And the answer is, it may or it may not. So you might decide that on balance, you take the risk. Let them get the oil and let's see how it is. But the fundamental change that's going on in Africa is that a significant part of the growth in Africa today is coming from the non-commodity sector. It's coming from financial services, telecoms, consumer. A lot of that is now beginning to drive growth in Africa. Because when you look at Africa right now, the demographics are incredible, absolutely incredible. So many young people. Productivity is only going to go one way. Okay, if you look at mobile banking, for example, Africa is leading the world, not because we're terribly smart, but because we don't have the infrastructure anyway, so we don't have the choice. Okay, so that's the only way to go if you really want to have financial services across Africa. So I think that the two things that are happening. One is that the resource commodity economy is still going to be significant. It's going to continue to grow. The challenge I have there personally is that I don't see enough Africans trying to build commodity businesses. I have a good friend, which some of you may have known, it's a guy called Sam Jonah. Sam Jonah built the 8th largest gold company in the world from Accra. In the end, he got taken over because scale is important, and he ran out of scale. And you could argue that he ran out of scale because he was based in Accra. I mean, if he was based in Johannesburg, maybe he would have had the scale, because Accra didn't have big enough banks to finance it. What to me is lacking currently is not the growth in resources or the direction of that, is that without exception, there are no African players. For some odd reason, Africans are retreating from setting up significant commodity companies. Call them junior multinationals, call them whatever, but be a player. I mean, once Ashanti moved out of gold, it was only the South African international companies. In the oil sector, all the junior majors, if you can use that phraseology, are based out of London or the States. Alfred is the only African party that's trying to build something. So that will be my action, that whichever direction it goes, let's be part of it. And if we get it right, we can shape the outcome. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we're doing again, giving Ms. Ekpe a round of applause and taking tremendous amount of questions.
We'd like to take a picture.
We're running slightly ahead of schedule, so we're going to take a short break. The first panels will start in about 30 minutes. There's the entrepreneurship panel in room 141, the healthcare panel in room 142 downstairs, and the mining panel upstairs here in room 332. Thank you.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Ready?
Yeah.